This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Upgrade your business with Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning fewer carts going abandoned and more sales going cha-ching. So if you're into growing your business, get a commerce platform that's ready to sell wherever your customers are. Visit shopify.com to upgrade your selling today.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The new year brings new health goals and wealth goals. Protecting your identity is an important step. LifeLock monitors millions of data points per second. If your identity is stolen, LifeLock's restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Resolve to make identity health and wealth part of your New Year's goals with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
The COVID-19 pandemic may be behind us, but as we hit the 5-year anniversary, there are still lots of questions and a lot of anger over how things were handled back then. Hello and welcome to the Full Comment Podcast. I'm Brian Lilly, your host. We're on a hiatus until the new year, but wanted to bring you our most listened to episode of 2024. Back in June, I had the chance to speak with Vanessa Dylyn, an award-winning director of the documentary COVID Collateral. And it shows how real scientific methods and debate were silenced, even banished, as governments faked expertise during COVID-19 with the help of compliant doctors and, quite frankly, a lot of journalists. It features people like Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, another former guest on Full Comment, and the man that President-elect Donald Trump recently nominated to run the American National Institutes of Health. I hope you enjoy the episode. We'll probably never know the full impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on society, be it health, be it mental well-being, be it the amount of pounds we put on, or the bad habits that we picked up as a result of it. But COVID-19 and the pandemic that saw much of society locked down had a huge impact on us. Hello, my name's Brian Lilly. Welcome to the Full Comment Podcast. A new documentary tries to look at the unseen impacts of the pandemic, of the lockdowns, of the government responses in both Canada and the United States. Were the decisions being made driven by science? Were they driven by politics? Were they driven by polling? These are some of the questions that we've asked and answered in the past, but Vanessa Dylyn, in her new documentary, COVID Collateral, examines them again, including speaking to some voices that we've heard from in the past, like Dr. Jay Bhattacharya. Vanessa, thanks for the time today.
Oh, you're welcome, Brian. Lovely to be with you.
What was the reasoning behind making this documentary and making it now? And I ask in the sense that the pandemic was a really dark time for a lot of people, and many just want to forget about it, don't even want to think about it or talk about it anymore, and don't show me a mask. So why go back to this topic?
Well, I think it's a very good time to go back to this period in our lives, because I think there needs to be some accountability for the policies which devastated and really upended people's lives. What motivated me to make this film was not just the level of human suffering, but also the fact that I learned that some of the policies were not based on science. For example, early in 2020, I noticed that there were some prominent scientists who were speaking up against lockdowns, people like Jay Bhattacharya, that you just mentioned, of Stanford, Dr. Scott Atlas, who is a really well-known public health policy scholar, Martin Kulldorff at Harvard, and Sunetra Gupta at Oxford. These were leaders in their field. They were speaking out against lockdowns, saying, we already have a pandemic plan in place, and we do not have the science to justify lockdowns. And based on their statements, they were demonized by their own universities, by medical institutions such as the NIH. They were being called fringe, and they were really being taken down in brutal ways by the media. And at the same time, I noticed that there was a discussion about the origin of the virus, and that Dr. Fauci, as the chief medical officer in the White House, tried to explain the origin of the virus as a natural evolution of animal to human, from animal to human transmission. Something that had jumped out of a wet market in Wuhan. But there were many leading scientists who noticed that there was this insert in the COVID virus genome, this thing called a furin cleavage, which could only have been created in a lab. So these leading scientists who sounded the alarm and said, "Hey, this looks like a lab leak here," these people were smeared.
Well, I remember writing on the lab leak theory early on, and not from a critical point of view that just said, "Oh, this is horrible, how dare we do this," but it was, I think the first time I heard it was CNN or the New York Times, and they pointed to a paper published earlier that year, probably in January of 2020, from scientists at a Chinese medical university. And everyone was talking about the lab leak theory as a very real possibility. No one said, "Oh, yes, for sure." No one said, "Absolutely not." And then Donald Trump mentioned it. And suddenly this became a conspiracy theory. And that to me was the beginning of, wow, this is incredibly political. Because the president mentioned something that the New York Times and CNN and medical doctors around the world have been discussing in academic papers and journals. Because he mentions it, we suddenly have to discredit it. That was shocking to me, and that was early in 2020.
Absolutely. And what we do see in the film is that through access to emails between Dr. Fauci and his group of scientists, we do see the early warnings from his own scientists saying, this does look like a lab leak. Then what they did a huddle, and they basically published an article in Science in
the magazine
Science
Science.
magazine, yes, in the magazine Science, saying that all the science points to the fact that this was a natural evolution, that this all came out of that the virus had escaped from a wet market and had jumped to a human being. Now, why would they do this? We do know that Dr. Fauci's department had been financing for a number of years coronavirus research at the Wuhan lab. So it would not have looked good for the public to actually find out that the coronavirus may have escaped from a Chinese lab that was being financed by the U.S.
And we all saw the State Department cables that came out showing that State Department officials had gone to visit the Wuhan lab and said, "We're working with these guys. The security is not up to our standards. We need to invest more here." And they weren't calling to invest more for gain of function or anything. They said, "We need to invest more here to make sure things are secure."
Yes, that's it. What had happened at the Wuhan lab was that the FBI and medical officials knew that the Wuhan Institute was classified as a level 4 biohazard lab. That is the highest level of let's say, danger in the world. But they were functioning as China will do, because they are rather careless about human beings and human health. They were functioning at a level 2, which is like your local dental office. Now, the Americans had become so concerned about this. A scientist called Peter Daszak, who was responsible for, in a sense, for parceling out the funding parceling out the American funding to the different departments at the Wuhan lab. He had become so concerned that as early as 2018, he asked for lab leak insurance from the NIH.
Wow.
And it was turned down. So people knew many years ago that there was danger, that there was, that the possibility of a lab leak was very possible.
Now, because of where this lab is, we will never know exactly what happened, how, and why, because the government of China will never allow it. I'm talking the very minute details, Vanessa. But once we get beyond that and the virus is introduced to the human population, there's a lot of questions to ask about the reaction. And that includes Fauci's recent testimony. And I want to point out that because America is the biggest player in the world, people listened around the world to what Dr. Fauci was saying. And his public health advice impacted public health advice here. And he was asked in a deposition or a committee hearing, I forget, where did this social distancing, keep 6 feet apart, where did that come from?
Yes.
And he said, I don't know, it just kind of appeared.
Yes. Yes. Well, that was it seemed to be the same kind of somewhat careless attitude about the imposition of lockdowns. Because one of the most revelatory things that we have in the film, and it's really right at the very end, is Dr. Francis Collins, the former head of the NIH, and he admitted in a confession type of interview that during the COVID crisis, there was one mentality there, and it was the public health mentality, which says that at any cost, lives must be saved. So he said we weren't thinking.
They didn't need to worry about the economy or social impacts.
Exactly. So what they didn't take into account, and he was very honest about this finally, what that public health mentality did not take into account was the fact that damage from lockdowns can take many forms. There's the social impacts, drug overdoses, mental health issues. We all know about all of the bankruptcies, we know how the lockdowns affected lower income people to a disproportionate level. Not just the small business owners who went bankrupt, who lost their livelihood, but there was a whole low income group of people who didn't get paid unless they showed up somewhere to work. I'm talking pre-vaccination here. This is the group
even
that,
post-vaccination, we were still closing restaurants or putting limits on them that made them economically unfeasible. And who's working in a restaurant serving you your meal? They're not exactly high net worth individuals normally.
Exactly.
They're people who are younger, students on the economic margins. And not to localize it too much, but I remember the public health officer for the city of Toronto arguing that restaurants needed to be closed. And I asked for the evidence. I said, how can you say that this is being spread in restaurants? Do you have evidence? And they pointed to 3 cases that they thought had been spread via restaurants. And I said, there's almost 8,000 restaurants in the city of Toronto, and you're going to close them all because of 3 suspected cases. And they said, yes. And that's the mentality that Dr. Francis Collins was talking about there. To hell with everything else, we're going to shut you down.
Absolutely. And we had all of the small business owners being driven bankrupt while the big box stores stayed open. So apparently you could catch COVID buying a box of nails at your small local hardware store, but not at Best Buy. And we all know that they kept the liquor stores open while shutting down churches, shutting down AA meetings, shutting down gyms, everything that kept people healthy. And so the big box stores were open, but children were being kept out of school for long periods of time. And, I know of a group of parents who would try to find these underground secret in-person classes for their children who obviously couldn't learn online. So it's the catastrophic effects on working people. I mean, the laptop class, the professional class who could work at home with minimal upheaval. I mean, they were, I'm not trying to minimize the way it upended people's lives, but compared to people who actually had to show up somewhere at a warehouse or stocking shelves, that laptop class got away quite well.
I'm in the laptop class,
yes,
and I could work from anywhere, and I did. I didn't have to show up in an office, but I'd been in that frontline worker class before, and having your life twisted up and down, sometimes with minimal notice, just because I would say that there was a huge spike in fear during the pandemic. I never thought that was fair. As you spoke to people like Scott Atlas and Jay and Roman Baber and others who you interviewed in the documentary, did you learn something new, or were you bringing together things that you already knew but that you hoped others needed to hear and understand?
What really shocked me was the statement from some of them that basically the expert class is not to be trusted. That was kind of, that was a shock for me. I am one of those compliant Canadians who, when they're told, they should be vaccinated, et cetera, I lined up like everyone else. And I shut down like everyone else. But what I learned during the course of making this film was that scientists are just as political as anyone else. And that scientists will sometimes twist information for political reasons, and that and I also learned that in my own industry, certain films were not being made. Certain films about big pharma were never going to see the light of day, simply because a lot of the big broadcasters are sponsored by big pharma.
Now, you've been a documentary filmmaker for many years, but not necessarily this type of film.
Right.
This is a bit of a departure for you, isn't it?
Well, in terms of this being a rather hot and controversial topic, yes. I mean, I've made other films. I've made films about terrorism, brain science films that offered up new ideas, but nothing this polarizing, certainly.
All right, we need to take a quick break. When we come back, though, I want to talk about the fear that drove so much of this, and whether that fear is still there. Will people hear the message of your documentary? Back in moments. During the worst parts of the pandemic, well, actually right up until the end, one of the worst things was it was a fact-free environment and things were driven by fear. Vanessa, I want to read you from something that I wrote in the fall of 2020. And it was about how in Ontario's first wave of COVID through nursing homes, which was incredibly devastating, we had a huge number of deaths. But when you look at it compared to a bad flu year, it turns out there were just 3.7% more deaths than in 2018, which was a bad flu year. And the profile of who would suffer and die from COVID was very similar to those who would suffer and die from influenza. When I published this based on ministry data and showing over multiple years what was actually happening, the minister was asked about it in a news conference here at Queen's Park and said, well, that's accurate. It's what the numbers show. And then was vilified by the media, who didn't dispute the numbers, just figured this should not be said. You should not be saying these things. That was repeated around the world, where people would raise, the Barrington Declaration and the people behind that, for example, would raise issues, or the study that you talked about that was conducted at Stanford. The raising facts did not change the fact that people were driven by fear, and then that fear informed polling, which informed decision-making around lockdowns and other issues.
Yes, I think we will never know how many people actually died from COVID. First of all, we do know that in the U.S. that many people who, let's say, died of cancer but had COVID were counted as COVID deaths, not cancer deaths. They were counted as COVID deaths because those hospitals got supplementary financing for every COVID death.
It took us months at the Toronto Sun,
yes,
to badger the Ontario government to start reporting died with COVID versus died from COVID, because there is a difference.
Oh.
And they did not have that financial incentive here, but they were still reporting all COVID deaths as the same. In fact, I was counted as a COVID hospitalization at one point, not because I went to the hospital with COVID. I didn't know I had COVID. I went to the hospital because I smacked my head and had a traumatic fall and a horrible concussion. And while I'm laying there, they test me for COVID and it came back positive. But I was counted as a COVID hospitalization. I had no symptoms.
Yes, that's it. It's not, your case isn't that uncommon. I mean, certainly at the children's hospitals and the one of the pediatricians in our film, who was at McMaster, said that if a child was admitted, let's say for her tonsils, and she just happened to have COVID, she was counted as a COVID hospitalization. Now, that is, to me, is unconscionable. That is, if we can't rely on our institutions for accuracy of information, where do we go? This also played out on a very big scale when, with the Imperial College of London, who had put out the estimation of fatalities over several months. This was in early 2020, and he had estimated that in the U.S. alone there were going to be 2 million people that were going to lose their lives if they didn't lock down. Well, what we do know was that the numbers were so wrong, they were exponentially wrong, that the actual number of fatalities were just a fraction. And the numbers person, Neil Ferguson at the Imperial College of London, admitted that his numbers were grossly wrong, but he did state that he didn't expect governments would base their health policies on his estimates. So my point again, if we cannot rely on these experts for accurate information, where is the average person supposed to turn?
I'd say this, and I'd like to hear your view on it. I can almost forgive those early days of mistakes like that, because we didn't know what we didn't know, and we didn't know what we were dealing with. And the horrific scenes out of Italy and out of China scared everyone in North America, scared everyone around the world. And we thought, well, okay, and now we've got this. And then once we had real data, though, once we had real experience, it still didn't seem to matter. The fear drove the policy. And parents demanded that schools be closed because doctors went on TV and said schools need to be closed. And it didn't matter if you had 5 other doctors saying no. Well, you've got, nonstop TV channels saying kids are going to die. Kids were not dying from COVID, not in any great numbers. I am sure that we could find a small number somewhere, but normally, just like elderly people that died of COVID with underlying conditions, or as the doctors call it, darkly, comorbidities.
Exactly.
I still had people arguing with me at the end of COVID that we were all at risk, and it didn't matter what your risk profile looked like. We were all facing the same risk, which is factually not untrue.
Exactly.
It's bizarre.
Yes, you're right. The average age of a COVID patient was 83, which is, I think, higher than life expectancy. About risk stratification. This is where I think the public health, where public health really fell down, and also the media should also be held responsible for this. The risk stratification was not explained to the public. They didn't explain to the public that 97% of people were going to be fine if they were exposed.
Well, some of us did.
Yes, if they were exposed to COVID. That young people, especially children, but young people, if they didn't have if they were not immunocompromised, they should be fine. They may not even know they had COVID, but the media made it seem as if everyone was at equal risk. Mm-hmm. And I think this is one of the things that led to one of our policies that I will never be able to get my mind around, and I think is very sad, is that we forced people to die alone. We forced people to people who were either terminally ill or elderly people who were dying. We forced their relatives to say goodbye to them through an iPad. Now, that to me is one of the most cruel and inhumane acts that was ever committed during COVID. If you can imagine your mother slipping away or your father slipping away and you can't be with them, you can't comfort them. They're alone in that room. I've often asked myself, how could we have done this? And who were we protecting?
One of my colleagues won a national newspaper award for a well-used, often used photo of a mother at the window of her long-term care home,
yes,
trying to touch their loved one through the glass. That was an absolutely horrific policy, one that was replicated around the world. And if somebody came up with one bad policy, we all seemed to just adopt it without stopping to think. And it was bizarre. We would have arguments over lockdowns or opening up. Well, if we're being honest, you look at the United States, California had some of the strictest lockdowns, mm-hmm. and at times had some of the worst COVID outcomes. Florida was more open, not as open as people think, but more open. And theirs went up and down as well. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they were doing great. Sometimes they were doing horribly. And you could show that and say, well, the lockdowns aren't helping. And the argument would be, yes, they are. You can't say that. Mm-hmm. Again, back to people not wanting evidence. Now, I want to ask you about this. You spoke to many people who are against it, including Roman Baber, who worked in the building I'm sitting in now as an elected official. Mm-hmm. Roman would actually show up with data and information and try and make the argument. But many in the anti-lockdown camp would say, and this is where I ended up breaking with them, they would say, well, you can't lock us down. And I remember saying to some leaders and organizers of it, I said, and I wrote a column about this, I said, you've got to come up with a better argument than what you're using right now, which you're just saying, you can't lock me down, it's a violation of my rights. Because the general public you can see that the general public does not care about your rights and is demanding more lockdowns. The politicians gave people what they demanded.
Yes.
And they said, I shouldn't have to explain it. And I said, then I can't help you because you do need to explain it, because people are scared, and mostly scared due to my colleagues and some doctors who have been proven fundamentally flawed and wrong. What do we do going forward with future pandemic plans? I mean, we will have more pandemics. We had them before and we didn't react like this. The swine flu pandemic several years ago was actually detrimental to children. I remember holding my son, like a deadweight, a flopping doll at the hospital to get him medical attention. Schools weren't closed. Daycares weren't closed.
No. Brian, we've had a pandemic plan in place just like the U.S. And I know the U.S. has been a pandemic plan, which is similar to ours, has been in place since 2006, because medical leaders knew it was just a question of when we dealt with the pandemic, because the last one was in 1918, the Spanish flu, and they knew that we were overdue. But the pandemic plan generally stated that there were to be no school closures and no lockdowns because of the impact on society, but that the most vulnerable people in society needed to be protected. This pandemic plan was ignored because of pressure from the WHO to lock down. But I think moving forward, I think people have lost trust in our institutions, and I think moving forward, we need to demand accurate information from our leaders, from our institutions. We need to demand calm facts. We need to expect better from our media, because the media played a huge role in this fear mongering. And I think if we really need to drill deep down and go back to basics, I think we need to start teaching our children. We need schools that teach children facts and critical thinking, not indoctrination. Otherwise, if we keep going down this path, we're finished as a society. We really need to demand that we need to demand much better information from our leaders, and we especially need leaders that will serve Canada, not the globalists who serve the interests of the WEF or the WHO, but leaders that serve their country's interests.
Vanessa, it's a fascinating documentary, extremely well produced, the highest quality. Let people know where they can find out more or where they can watch it.
Thank you. They can find out more on the website at www.covidcollateral.com. We will be posting when the film is available.
Okay. Thank you very much for your time and for the film. Hopefully we'll talk again soon.
Thank you, Brian.
Full Comment is a post-media podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. This episode was produced by Andre Prue with theme music by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libin is the executive producer. Remember to subscribe to Full Comment on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast. Help us out by leaving us a rating or a review and telling your friends about us. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I'm Brian Lilly.